Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how are you today? In today's video, we're going to continue with We Had Everything But Money, okay? During the Depression, we lived on a small farm along the Illinois River, so we knew what feed sack dresses were all about. All our dresses and skirts were made from that material, and only that material. We went to town once a week to exchange eggs for groceries and to buy whatever else we needed for the week. The highlight of the trip was always the stop at the feed store, where we delighted to see all the pretty material, and my sisters and I usually got to choose which print we wanted. On one of those trips, I found a rose pattern print I will never forget. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. To my disappointment, only 2 sacks were available in that print, and my mother would need at least 3 to make what I wanted, a new dress. We took the 2 sacks anyway. All the way home, I kept hoping that my mother would stretch those sacks somehow, or that a miracle would turn the 2 sacks into 3. As I lay down to sleep that night, I prayed for a new dress out of those 2 small pieces of cloth, but I knew my prayers wouldn't be answered. It just couldn't be done. Next morning, when I went downstairs, hanging there in the kitchen doorway was a beautiful rose-patterned jumper. Without saying a word, my mother had made it for me after I went to bed. The design was plain, but to me, it was the most beautiful dress I could have ever imagined. I was proud to wear it to church on Easter Sunday. Our family of 5 moved to Colorado from Missouri just before the Depression started. Money was always scarce, but we got to buy thanks to the food and animals we raised, and thanks to my mother's thrift. I don't know when I first heard the phrase, make over, make do, or make without. But it must have been during the Depression. Our clothes were usually hand-me-downs from friends and neighbors, but Mother made them over to fit us. And they always looked like they were our very own clothes and not someone else's. One winter, a neighbor gave Mother several old coats, skirts, and men's suits made from wool, corduroy, and other heavy materials. Mother ripped them apart, pressed the fabric, cut the pieces into squares, and made quilt tops, half of which she returned to the neighbor she believed in share and share alike. Those quilts made warm covers on cold winter nights. Mother taught my twin sister Martha and me how to sew too. We used her basting thread, which she saved for us by pulling it out in one long, unbroken piece. Years later, a childhood friend told me that she and her sisters always liked coming to our house because she could sew doll clothes. They couldn't do that because her family couldn't afford to buy any extra thread. I just assumed that all mothers saved their basting thread for their daughters' sewing projects. Occasionally, Mother was able to buy some new material, usually an inexpensive cotton print. If Martha and I were lucky, we each got 1 new dress in the fall, and our brother got 1 new pair of pants. We always changed clothes immediately after school because new clothes had to last the whole year. Another way we got by during those years was to collect our own firewood. In the summer, Daddy would hitch up the horse on the wagon, and we'd pack a picnic lunch and head for the river about a mile away. While Mother and Daddy sawed up big limbs and dead tree trunks, we kids collected all the smaller pieces of wood we could find. When we got too hot and tired, we'd take off our shoes and socks and go wading in the cool, clear water. We were all tired by the time we got home in the late afternoon, but it was always a great day, and we'd have enough firewood to last a very long time. I believe those of us who grew up in those times were richer than we realized. We learned to cope with almost everything, and we learned some very, very valuable lessons. Those experiences have stayed with me too. I've always shared my quilt scraps, magazines, and books with others who might enjoy them. I still save every scrap of sewing materials, make scratch paper from junk mail, and stash away all my plastic grocery bags and cottage cheese containers. I'm very glad that many of these items can be recycled now. Sometimes my children and grandchildren kid me for saving so many things, but they never went through the Depression. Those of us who did will never forget it. Making do without complaint was a universal characteristic of families who lived through the dirty 30s. But really, what choice did we have? There was very little money. Our family lived in southeastern Colorado, and I remember making do even as a child. My grandmother sent me a coat when I was 2.5 years old. It was so large that my fingers didn't reach the edge of the cuff until I was in the 3rd grade. It was a perfect fit by that time I reached 5th grade. Having been swallowed up in that big coat for 8 long years, I just didn't like it anymore. My older brother had a coat just like mine and just as oversized. I don't think he liked his coat either. The outer shell of those coats was made of a material called oilskin. It was slick and looked like plastic. My coat was red and my brother's green. Though they weren't much to behold, our coats were lined with sheepskin and were very warm. We never complained about our old coats because we didn't know any different, and complaining wouldn't have done much good anyway. There was no money for new coats. As I was entering the 5th grade, however, I did make one comment. Mother was taking out our winter clothes when I happened to see my coat. "Do I have to wear this again?" I asked. I did have to, but not for long. A few months later, at Christmas, I was overwhelmed to open a package and found a beautiful blue cloth coat. The rest of the gifts were the usual Christmas fare: pecans and orange in our stockings and maybe a pair of mittens. I hardly noticed those gifts at all because I was so thrilled with my new coat. Finally, I had a coat I didn't have to grow into. As I look back through those years, that blue coat remains the highlight of all my Christmases. My parents couldn't afford a new coat, but somehow they made the sacrifice for me. It was that kind of sharing and love that saw us through the dirty 30s. I made many of my own clothes when I was in high school, but my senior year in 1934 posed a special challenge. As graduation time approached, the high school and 7th and 8th grade students cast votes for a senior girl as homecoming queen. I had made no special plans for homecoming, thinking I didn't have a chance. But when the votes were counted, I had won. Naturally, I was excited, but when I told my parents I would need a special dress for homecoming, they said we just couldn't afford one. I was disappointed, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I knew I could make the dress myself if I could just find the money for materials. I sometimes worked in the principal's office, answering the phone and helping with paperwork, and I knew there was a petty cash fund used to buy supplies for needy students. One day I got up the nerve and asked the principal if the school could give me just enough money to buy some material for my homecoming dress. He said anyone who receives such an honor should be willing to buy her dress. When I explained that I couldn't afford it, he asked, "How much money are we talking about?" I replied, "I think I can make the dress for about $1.20. The principal just smiled and said, "Anyone who thinks she can make a homecoming queen's dress for $1.20 deserves a chance to try." And he gave me the money. A friend drove me to the nearest village, where I bought 7 yards of cheesecloth for 70 cents, 3 packages of white crepe paper for 45 cents, and a small spool of thread for 5 cents. I made a foundation garment from part of the cheesecloth, hand-stitched crepe paper for the bodice, ruffled a piece of paper for a collar, and then cut the rest of the paper into strips for ruffles. which I stitched in tears from the waist to the floor. The rest of the cheesecloth was used to make a train. My crown was a piece of cardboard covered with gold foil. I carried a bouquet of fresh apple blossoms from my parents' orchard. The highlight of my reign came from when my mother, the mother of a younger student, said, "My daughter thinks you're beautiful, and she wants to look just like you when she graduates." Mildred Gilliam, Tip City, Ohio. Not all feed and flour sacks were taken apart for sewing. Some were left intact for carrying and storing things. On wash day, many women would put their undergarments inside a bag and hang it in a sunny spot. That way, the underwear got dry, but without being seen by all the neighbors. Mary Alice Pope, Pocahontas, Arkansas. In the Deep Depression days of the early 1930s, we lived in a drafty old tenant farmhouse. My mother worked hard to make it home, and even at age 6, I knew that she was usually very creative. We had no running water, but thanks to Mother, we did have a sink. She punched a hole in the bottom of an old dishpan, attached a funnel underneath, and hooked that up to a rubber hose that ran through a hole cut in the floor. Wow, that's creative. That's just one example of how Mother learned to make do. And here are a few more. In our front room, she covered the bare wooden walls with a combination of burlap feed sacks and 3 different patterns of wallpaper a friend had given her. She worked the wallpaper scraps into an attractive design, affixing them with flour and water paste. Mother even made a sofa for us. She cut some old bed springs in half with an axe and placed the springs on a wooden frame she had built herself. She made the seats and back from a chintz fabric. Chintz is CHINTZ. Backed with flannel, and stuffed the cushions with unginned cotton she had picked with her own hands. The central room of our house was covered with wallboard, and Mother took care of that too. She went to the creek bank and brought home tubs and buckets of clay, which she spread over the walls. When the clay dried, it was a pale buff color, much more attractive than the wallboard had been. Johnny Gregory, Mathis, Texas. Wow, that's creative. In early 1930, I was about to enter nursing school, and I needed a raincoat. Like all country folks at the time, we had very little money. Most of the raincoats I had seen were very cheap and tacky looking, at least to my young taste. I had my heart set on a French-style coat that I had seen in one department store. That coat cost the unheard-of sum of $14.98. I had all of $15.77 in the bank. I begged my father to let me withdraw the money, and after some time, he finally relented. The next day, a local bank in Newton Falls, Ohio, closed. Daddy never again saw the money he had in the bank. But I had my raincoat, and it lasted for years and years. Mary Frances Evans, Ocala, Florida. Wow. To think that a raincoat costed $15 back then, and it would literally break your bank, literally. I mean, wow. My dad worked in construction, building new homes, but when the Depression hit, there was no new construction. After searching for work for several weeks, he finally found a job driving a cab. And Dad worked long hours and barely made enough for us to live on, so there was no money left for things like linens. But my mother was thrifty and used her sewing machine to help us economize. When our sheets wore out, the material would be threadbare in the middle. Mother would rip the sheet right in half, and she'd sew outside edges together, then hem the worn sides. And the sheet now had a seam down the middle, but we got use out of it. And when the sheets became too worn to use on the beds, Mother used the least worn parts to make pillowcases. She even used the scraps to make pot holders, which she trimmed with red stitching. No one could stretch the life out of a common white sheet like my mother. And she also put her skills to work on my father's shirts. When a collar became frayed, she carefully ripped it out and turned it around and reinsert it into the body of the shirt, and the collar looked almost like new. When I outgrew a dress, Mother let down the hem, which invariably left a worn white line, and Mother had a solution for that too. She covered the old hemline with tape or rickrack, which not only disguised the old hemline, but gave the dress a lift. Our family got through the Depression just fine, thanks to Dad's cab driving and Mother's thrift. It may be surprising to youngsters, but the jeans we wore through the Depression were very much like the ones in style today, faded and wrinkled from repeated washing. I'll admit our jeans didn't fit like those of today, but we certainly got more for our money. We called jeans Bibeless overalls back in the 30s, though Levi Strauss sold them as waist overalls. I bought my jeans through the Sears catalog, and there was nothing glamorous about them. They were actually men's pants, as no jeans were made specifically for women until 1935. I wore them cinched in at the waist with a leather belt. High fashion didn't matter around the house or farmyard. When I wanted to go to town, I had two dresses to choose from. One morning, I was putting one of them on, and I found that a grasshopper had gnawed a big hole in the front of it. I was reduced to one good outfit, just like my husband, who had one pair of pants and one sweater, besides the jeans and shirt he wore every day. Our kids' clothes were strictly makeovers. Relatives gave us their used clothes, though these articles were old and they were constructed of good material, and when made up, they really looked nice. I made pants for our son from a pair of his grandpa's corduroys, and I made his coat from an old coat of mine. Used coats normally look just like new when they were turned inside out. We'd never heard of recycling back in the 1930s, but we were practicing it, and everyone was making do. It wasn't so bad to have wearing cheap clothes if all of your neighbors wore the same kind. There was no such thing as liquid soap in the 1930s, and we all used salt sacks to invent our own. The salt sacks were 6 to 7 inches wide and 10 to 12 inches long, and we used them as dishcloths. After carefully removing the pull thread to make liquid soap, we'd put a bar of crystal white soap in the sack and soak it in dishwater. In a few minutes, the soap was soft enough to make a lather inside the sack. And once the soap had softened, just enough to blow a little air inside, then we'd close the sack and squeeze. The result was plenty of bubbles, just like the ones we'd get today by adding a little liquid soap to the dishwater. The convenience of today's dishwashing liquid is nice, but it was a lot more fun to make your own. Margaret Berlin, Great Falls, Montana. Interesting. When I graduated from high school in 1931, the only job I could find was a helper in a sign shop. The job paid $7.50 a week for 60 hours of work. At the time, many thousands of people were unemployed, and they spent their days walking the streets to look for work. In doing so, they wore out a lot of shoe leather. The 5 and dime stores came up with an economical answer to that problem. The stores sold stick-on rubber shoe soles for 20 cents a pair, complete with a tube of rubber cement. Such do-it-yourself shoe repairs were messy, but very practical. So many miles were put on shoe soles that it inspired some wry humor. Whenever a person met a friend on the street, he would ask the friend, "Are you working now?" "Yes," the friend would reply, "for Walker and Turner." This meant he was walking the streets and turning the corners. R.S. Kroom, Norfolk, Virginia. That's very funny. Both my daughters were born during the Depression, and we had to make do with whatever we could. I was a proud mother and wanted my little girls to have shoes, so I cut patterns to fit their feet and made shoes from secondhand felt hats. Our relatives and neighbors helped out by giving me hats they no longer needed, and the shoes were made in a moccasin style, so I'd stitch designs or sew beads on them and make them prettier. The felt would wear out quickly, so I'd make new shoes from the heap of old hats every Friday or Saturday. That way my daughters would have new shoes for church on Sunday. Mrs. Clark, Valley Head, Alabama. That's awesome. I love that. Living through the Depression helped us grow and made us better folks. It gave me strength I'd never had before. My aunt kept our old farmhouse warm and saved on fuel by stuffing straw beneath rugs. All of us kids would drag the rugs outside and beat them on the clothesline to remove the dust, and then we'd fill the buckets with soapy water and wrap towels around our feet, dip them in the water, and waltz all over the floors. Our aunt played marching music on the old Victrola to urge us on, and we'd skid over the floors and laugh and have a marvelous time. After we'd soap the floors, my oldest brother would wrap burlap sacks around his feet and carefully go over the floors to remove the water. When the floors were dry, we'd scattered fresh straw over the floor, paying special attention to the corners and any cracks. Finally, the big rugs were brought back inside and placed on top of the straw and tacked down. After about a week, the stuffing would flatten out and we'd have nice warm floors. Electricity in rural areas was expensive then, but our aunt had a way to save money on that as well. During the summer, when the fans were running, she'd hang up wet sheets across the doorways of our bedrooms to help keep us cool and comfortable. We'd also save money by storing our food in the cool spring house. Milk and cream, butter, vegetables, fruits, and some meats were all placed in and around the stream, and sometimes we kids sat in the spring house to cool off too. Although those were grind times, we had many bright moments, and I believe the lack of money actually brought our family to closer. The days I remember most vividly are those when we did things together. Junie Dunklin, Sandersville, Georgia. Okay, guys, that's all for this video. I love you. I'll see you in the next one. You stay safe. You stay positive. You keep prepping. And as always, fear less. Ciao.